Aloha! This is Chapter 24.3 European Claims in Muslim Regions. Okay, really, if we're going to talk about colonization of Muslim lands, the biggest story to be told is the Ottoman Empire and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So you kind of have to go back to 1500s. The Ottoman Empire is just coming into its own. It has conquered Constantinople and it is expanding across North Africa, which is following the line where Islam conquered centuries before, Eastern Europe, and all the way down into the Fertile Crescent area, what is today Iraq, and just a tiny bit of Iran, and all of the peninsula of Turkey. So that's the Ottoman Empire. To kind of give an overview, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire was done by expanding European powers, and they were nibbling away at the edges of the Ottoman Empire until by the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was a fraction of its former self, and it was teetering on disintegration, and World War I is really going to finish it off. So after World War I, all of those territories that had been part of the Ottoman Empire, Muslim territories, get either made into independent nation states or they become protectorates, quote unquote, of European powers. And as we learned previously, a protectorate is basically just another form of a colony. So the Ottoman Empire is going to fall to European powers. All right, there it is. That's the overview. That is what we're going to talk about today. So let's get to it. Okay, if we're going to understand the Muslim empires, we have to understand that they see religion and government as being a unified thing. The moment you break those two apart, it no longer has the favor of God, and your government is going to not be a successful or effective government. So in the Muslim mind, the ideal form of government is a Sharia law government, a government that follows the laws that are set in the Quran. The Muslim ideal, whenever a society starts to become more and more secular, they have a belief that there is a figure that will rise to the surface, and he is usually called the Mahdi, which kind of is like the Messiah in Christian vocabulary. But they don't mean the Messiah as in of God. They just mean a savior of the civilization. Somebody who is going to come and purify the people and the practice of Islam. And so there were several examples of that. Do you remember from the last episode we talked about Usman Fodio? He was kind of seen as that kind of a figure, the Mahdi. But an even stronger figure would have been one that popped up in Western Sudan about this time, about the 1800s. And the goal is to try to get rid of the secular influences and create a more pure Sharia law type of government. The problem is the Ottomans, they had been in power for many, many centuries, and they were very secularized as leaders. And so they kind of lost their support of these outlying territories that are also Muslim. And they don't look at the Ottomans as being paragons of leadership. They actually look at them as being more like de facto leaders rather than the desirable leaders. One territory like that would be Egypt. Egypt was probably the perfect classic example. So Egypt is an ancient civilization, as you know. They adopted Islam when it swept through North Africa in the 700s, when the earliest Muslim armies were conquering all of the surrounding territory. But then the Ottomans came in and they also conquered Egypt. And the Ottomans had an interesting practice. They would take conquered peoples, usually Christians from Eastern Europe, and they would force them to pay a tax. And the tax was you have to send a certain number of young Christian boys to the capital, to Constantinople, where they would get an elite education. And they would become an elite force that the Ottomans could use to control their territory. They became orphans because the families that had to give up these sons, they were no longer allowed to have any access. They lost track of their boys. And the boys were then put into like dormitory situations, and they're trained and brainwashed into becoming an elite servant of the Ottoman emperor. They were called Janissaries. And so there was an army of Janissaries that actually ended up conquering Egypt and ended up ruling Egypt. And it eventually becomes its own semi-independent state. And as time goes by, they're going to gain more and more independence. And there's really nothing that the Ottoman Empire can do about it because they don't have the military strength to go and reconquer Egypt. Egypt really starts to become truly independent in the early 1800s. Muhammad Ali, appointed by the Ottomans to help govern Egypt, and one of the problems was Egypt was being menaced by quite a few European countries because the Suez Canal was a possibility. England wanted to build it. They had the strongest navy in the world, and they also owned India, and they needed a way to travel to India quickly. The French also saw the value of this, and they were also bidding for that. And when Napoleon decides to move his troops down to Egypt during the French Revolution, before he is made into the ruler of France, he goes down to Egypt. And part of his travels down there is to try to win that territory so that France can be the one to own and build the Suez Canal. Well, what are the Ottomans doing at this point? Mainly just minor skirmishes. They don't really see Napoleon as a true threat, and Napoleon is fairly ineffective. Soon, that threat is gone, but the British threat sticks around. And this is how the British ended up getting the territory that they wanted. They didn't do it militarily. They did it economically. It was economic warfare by offering loans that the government could not refuse. And because the Egyptian government knew that this was going to be a money maker. So the Suez Canal was a wonderful opportunity, and they were willing to take out loans with fairly high interest rates. It seemed like the taxes were going to keep coming in, and they would be able to pay back their loans, but you never know what the economy is going to do, right? And also, when Egypt starts to break away from the Ottoman Empire, it loses some of its economic stability. And so Egypt is unable to pay back a loan. They have to give up some of the rights to the Suez Canal until finally British basically completely take over the canal. This is a difficult thing for Egypt because this is their one of their main sources of income. But it was not their only source. So Muhammad Ali, in the early 1800s, before the Suez Canal was built, he had seen some very good ideas of how to improve Egypt's economy. First, they had to get rid of the medieval style of land tenure because at this point they had some big landowners and then a lot of peasants who had basically nothing, and they worked for basically nothing, and they had no incentive to work harder than what their daily needs were. He starts to put in place private ownership, and this gets the Egyptian peasants working much, much harder because now they can actually work their way up the social ladder. And then he also sponsors a widening of the irrigation canals that kind of feather out from the Nile River, and that widened the strip of arable land that Egypt had. Now they're producing double or triple the amount of crops, and the big crop that was the moneymaker for them was cotton. Cotton, it needs a huge amount of water. It didn't seem like it would be a problem because the Nile is very, very consistent, and there's a lot of water that's coming down through the Nile, but it got to be a problem because all the water was getting used up in the southern part of Egypt, where the Nile starts. He's also going to hire engineers to start looking for places to build dams because that would help regulate the water flow. And so all of this is stuff that Muhammad Ali started, but he doesn't get to finish his ideas. He dies in 1848, and about 10 years later, the next guy who comes to the throne, he does not have nearly as much skill as Muhammad Ali. Whoever controls the Suez Canal basically is going to have the most powerful navy in the world. And so, of course, the British are the ones who monopolize that. So other parts of the Ottoman Empire start to break apart. But I want to shift our eyes over a little bit to the east. The Ottoman Empire was not the only Muslim territory. There are more territories in going progressively farther east. So right next to the Ottoman Empire is another Muslim territory. It was Iran, but all of that territory was combined into the Persian Empire. Okay, so the Persian Empire, there are European powers who are looking at the Persian Persian Empire with a lot of interest because oil has become one of the most important natural resources, and Persia actually has a lot of that. So whoever owned Persia would be able to utilize those resources. Persia was being threatened on all sides, and eventually it's the British who are going to take control of that territory. They put in not a protectorate, but put in place a king that they chose. He doesn't last very long, actually. His son is the last of that dynasty. His son is going to be deposed by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1978, and they put in place a theocracy. Theocracy is supposed to be a direct. And going farther east, the third empire would be the Mughal Empire. That was in northern India. By the 1700s, Europeans have shown up on the shores of India. By the late 1700s, England has kicked the other European powers out of India and has also infiltrated into the different kingdoms that make up the subcontinent of India by the late 1700s. And by the 1800s, they have completely dominated the subcontinent. It's going to go from being an economic enterprise, like a company running India, the British East India Company. They were just being too cruel to the people. They were totally squeezing them for every cent they could. So the British government steps in and begins to rule in India as an actual colony. They start to try to bring in some education for the people and trying to help the people a bit. We'll learn about that tomorrow.